Hello, everyone. Peter Maravellis here on behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers and our friends at PM Press. I'd like to welcome you to day 2 of Dangerous Visions and New Worlds, a weekend-long symposium exploring the radical currents of science fiction. We are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as San Francisco. Through a series of panel sessions and interviews, we explore a time when science fiction became an ideal vehicle for an upsurge in radical protest, with the rise in the 50s and 60s of liberatory and resistance movements focused on the inequalities of class, race, gender, and sexuality. A new wave of authors arose whose works shattered the writing conventions of the day. Their works skirted the tried and true tropes of genre and instead incorporated contemporary themes such as ecology, feminism, sexual liberation, antipathy towards the Vietnam War, and an identification with the rising currents of counterculture, which included everything from Black Power through to psychedelics. Dangerous Visions offers a sampler of work to whet your appetite and offer new perspectives on key novels and authors, as well as an exploration of topics, works, and writers who have largely been forgotten or undeservedly ignored. It celebrates the publication of a new book by PM Press, which shares the same title as our symposium. It's edited by Andrew Nette and Iain McIntyre. It contains over 20 chapters written by contemporary authors and critics and hundreds of full cover images, including 13 thematically organized cover sections. I mean, they're just beautiful eye candy, so worth the price of admission just for that alone. We're going to be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of the book, and also indeed books by all our authors today. So our first session this morning, number 5 in the series, is titled The Forever War, Vietnam's Impact on Science Fiction. It is moderated by Andrew Nette and will feature appearances by Terry Bisson and Marge Piercy. This is going to be a very timely discussion as we find our world once again on the brink. If the events of the last week have shown us anything, it's how we continue to be haunted by the specters of nationalism, not just at home, but around the world. So a word about our participants. Andrew Nette is a writer of fiction and nonfiction based in Melbourne, Australia. He is the co-editor of Girl Gangs, Biker Boys, and Real Cool Cats, Pulp Fiction and Youth Culture, and Sticking It to the Man, Revolution and Counterculture in Pulp and Popular Fiction, as well as the author of other works of nonfiction and 2 novels. He has contributed reviews in nonfiction to the Los Angeles Review of Books, Sight and Sound, Australian Book Review, and British Film Institute, amongst others. Together with Iain McIntyre, he is the co-editor of Dangerous Visions and New Worlds, Radical Science Fiction, 1950 through 1985. Joining him will be Terry Bisson. Terry Bisson is an award-winning science fiction and fantasy author. He is best known for his short stories, including Bears Discover Fire, which won the Hugo Award and the Nebula Award, and They're Made Out of Meat. He is the author of numerous novels, and his short fiction has appeared in countless anthologies. He makes his home in California. Also joining us will be Marge Piercy. Marge Piercy's reputation precedes her. She is an award-winning poet, novelist, and activist. She is the author of 17 novels, including the New York Times bestseller Gone to Soldiers, the national booksellers Braided Lives, and The Longings of Women, and the classic Women on the Edge of Time. She has produced 17 volumes of poetry and critically acclaimed memoir called Sleeping with Cats. She's been a key player in many of the major progressive political battles of our time. We're really very, very honored to have her join us here today. So before we begin, I'd like to remind you, we will be posting links with which you may purchase copies of Dangerous Visions and books by the rest of our authors. So please welcome now Andrew Nette to get things started.
Thank you very much, Peter, and greetings, everyone. And thank you for taking some time out to join us today. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge that I am zooming today from Aboriginal land, specifically the territory of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung Indigenous people, and I want to acknowledge that their sovereignty over this territory has not been ceded. As Peter said today, I'm delighted to be joined by 2 prominent science fiction authors and political activists, Marge Piercy and Terry Bisson. And against the backdrop of a new imperial war in Europe, we today are talking about another imperial war, a previous imperial war, but perhaps one that's got some lessons to teach us to this situation now, the one in Vietnam, and its impact in science fiction, on science fiction, I should say. And by way of introduction, and because there are probably people watching today who may not be familiar with all the events that we're discussing, I think it would be useful to start if both of you could look back and situate yourselves in the context of the war in Vietnam. And I'll start with you, Marge. You were directly involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement. Your second book, your first science fiction novel, Dance the Eagle to Sleep, 1970, was actually written in the late 1960s while you were working as an organizer in New York for the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS as they were better known. How you managed to write a book that good while working for the SDS is absolutely a mystery to me. But please tell us a little bit about how you came to be working for SDS and very briefly what the experience was like.
The man I was living with at the time had been traveling before we got together in Asia, and his best friend was still there, and he was in Vietnam, and he was sending back letters about how we were meddling already in 1963, 64. We already had boots on the ground there. So I was very angry about the war, but my previous activities had all been civil rights, and CORE wasn't interested. So around that time, I started searching for some way to express activism against the war. I moved to New York, and I started also going to Ann Arbor, where the Voice chapter had originated, became SDS. And we brought two of the activists back to New York, and we started North American Congress on Latin America, which still exists, which I was very active in until I was recruited, because I'm skipping a lot of stuff. I was the only person that in the SDS who could be brought into the SDS office who had experience with off-campus organizing instead of just on-campus organizing. So I worked on that until SDS, until Quantilpro, Nixon's program of infiltrating radical organizations, both the Black and the Native American and us. He was infiltrating all of them. And it became almost impossible because they would come in and they would break things up, and just, things became factions. And I also got very angry about how men in the movement responded to women organizing as women. And so I left the New Left and worked in the women's movement, but still on anti-war stuff. We did a lot of anti-war stuff in the women's movement.
So sorry, keep going.
Ahead.
Sorry. No, I was going to say, so you've already touched on this. So Dance the Eagle to Sleep has been viewed by some critics as a text about your personal disillusionment with the SDS and the anti-war movement, or we should maybe say the male.
Bullshit.
Okay.
That's bullshit. That's
Right.
total bullshit. No, I did it in the form of speculative fiction because
Right.
I didn't want to expose anybody. We were all doing a lot of illegal things, and there was enormous surveillance on us. I had the Red Squad in my basement with the live tap. When I moved to the Cape and we got rid of the old, my old huge desk, we found microphone in it and wires leading out that we had ripped off when we moved the desk from New York. There was this mail cover on it. I was getting death threats from the militia. Things were very heated toward the end. And I also got very sick. I developed a lung condition, and finally I got pneumonia and almost died. So I had to get out of New York because at that point in time, the air you could cut with a knife. And I was a smoker from the age, I was a street kid. So I started smoking when I was maybe 14 or something. By the time I was in my late 20s, I was getting sick from it. I was being treated free by a movement doctor who said to me one day, "It's not worth my time to treat you. You'll be dead in 2 or 3 years." I walked out of his office and never smoked another cigarette, but I had to get out of New York. So I came here and started organizing here.
Okay. Terry, can I ask you, much like Marge, you'd been a peace activist since the early 1960s. That's correct, yes?
Yes, that's correct. But I was not involved in science fiction in the 60s.
Right.
But I'll have something to say about that later, about the books that came out. Like Marge's book, Dance the Eagle to Sleep, that was a big influence on me because it was about Vietnam, but it wasn't in Vietnam. It never mentioned Vietnam. It was about the draft. It was about youth rebellion, about trying to build community and all the kind of stuff that the 60s brought about. I remember a big change. I would go to the demonstrations, but I was not part of an organization in the 60s when the war got in the news. And it was SDS that did that. It was SDS, their demonstrations would go from 25,000 people to 250,000 people. And it was just amazing. And I would go to those. But that was my whole connection with it until I never actually got involved in an anti-war. I went to all the demonstrations, but never took any actions or did anything until after 1970. So that was how I reacted to the war. The thing I remember the most is I lived down in what's now Soho, and we had a little collective of people, and I would eat breakfast in this little diner on 6th Avenue. Anyway, I remember reading the newspaper one morning, and it was when the Tet Offensive was going on, and I all of a sudden had this flash of insight that this wasn't a war in which the Vietnamese were just the victims, and we were trying to be gentle with them and stuff. They were going to win this war, and I realized that the U.S. this was the first anti-colonial defeat of arms that was taking place, and the U.S. was a big part of it. And it was a wonderful feeling. All of a sudden, I felt like my whole soul shifted from being a sort of liberal regretter of what the U.S. was doing to wanting to be part of the world that was rising, that seemed to be developing. So my reaction, my relationship with the war in that time was more intellectual and going to demonstrations and stuff than being an organizer. I didn't have that skill or that will to be organizing people. I never did that.
But you're saying that changed in the 1970s?
Well, in the 70s, yeah, there was lots of other things that changed, but the Vietnam changed the entire culture. Between the civil rights movement and Vietnam, it broke open all this other stuff, that people's need for collectivity, women's need for power, the men's need to open up and be less, all this stuff happened. Really, the war was, to me, the big trigger, even more than the civil rights movement, which had been a huge thing. The war changed all this stuff, but that's just my personal take on it.
You would agree with that, Marge? Obviously, that the war was just broke open so many things. Yeah.
I think it did, because and the draft also.
Yeah, of course.
And the civil rights movement and so on. I mean, the Black Panthers were involved in New York.
Yeah,
I did liaison with them sometimes.
Yeah.
And there was the Native American movement. I happened to be present in Chicago when the Native American movement was accidentally started by the anthropology department of the University of Chicago. I had a number of Indian friends then and later. So there were all these different movements coming up. They all influenced Women on the Edge of Time because I was involved with all of them. I also knew a lot about the foreign movements because they came through the SDS regional office. There were people active against the war and against anti-imperialism from France, from Germany, from Japan, from Mexico. Oh God, yes, Mexico.
So in terms of science fiction, obviously the Vietnam War and the whole counterculture and the movement in the 1960s, I think it's accurate to say that Vietnam fueled a lot of discontent with the science fiction establishment and was a key factor in what's now called the new wave of science fiction. An important event in this regard occurred in June 1968 in an issue of the American science fiction Galaxy, which featured two advertisements, one against US intervention in Vietnam and another in favor of it. And this each was signed by a lot of science fiction writers. I'm just curious whether both of you read Galaxy magazine, and if so, whether you're aware of these pro and anti-war advertisements in it. And were you surprised? No, you were. Terry, were you?
I never saw Galaxy magazine in my life. I read science fiction novels.
Right.
And I was quite aware of the growing anger against it because they were full of princesses and kings, and it was like going backwards instead of going forwards. And they had such an imperialistic attitude. You were going to go and conquer other people. It wasn't until the new wave started, and I was very aware of being part of the women's part of that. Joanna Russ was a very close friend of mine. We shared work. We were close till she died. We wrote all the time. We shared ideas. I would go and visit her. She wouldn't come visit me. She didn't like to travel, but I would go and see her. And I also knew Wyndham McIntyre, and I was aware of Ursula K, though I never knew her. I was very aware that we were trying to change science fiction to something that was more political, that was more egalitarian, that was more looking to the future and not the past, not a feudal past.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Terry?
Well, I wasn't part of the, like I say,
you weren't writing at the time, but
the what? Yeah, I got organized in '68, and I went to all the anti-war stuff, and I liked it. I knew who the Yippies were, and they were doing stuff in those days, and I was very attracted to SDS. Kind of more became the Weather Underground, and they had a very anti-imperialist point of view, and I really admired all them, but I was not part of it, and I was older than them. I was too old to be in SDS. There was no SDS.
You weren't too old. I was in SDS, and I was 10 years older than everybody.
Yeah, I know, but it didn't hit me that way. But I was attracted to all the anti-war groups. But then I got organized by the commune movement, which was a bunch of people. Their whole thing was, do you want to be part of destroying the old world or part of building the new one, which is a bullshit way of saying it, but it appealed to me. And so we all joined we all moved out to the Southwest and built geodesic domes and all that kind of stuff, and didn't do, and of course that was in 70 and 71. The draft was already on its way out, and the commune movement sort of collected all the, it was a different aspect of the counterculture that I was in at that point. So, but it's interesting to me, just in terms of the literature, because I later became, I'm not a scholar of science fiction, but I was later accepted into that community, which is a very generous, and I discovered as good writers as any of the mainstream people that aren't looked down on, and I knew, and I'd read their works, but I'm just thinking about when that ad was written in '68 and the response of science fiction as a literature to the Vietnam War was not one of the most important. It wasn't, we didn't have anything to say about it. Well, people would write, Marge wrote Dance the Eagle to Sleep. I think that Ursula Guin's the word for world is forest. I think that even Joe Haldeman's book, The Forever War, is really about Vietnam, but it's not about Vietnam. So science fiction never addressed it directly, always indirectly. That's my take on it.
What do you think about that, Marge?
Well, approaching it indirectly meant that you could be much more global. It wasn't our first imperialist activity. I mean, we overthrown governments in Iran, we overthrew governments in Guatemala. We were always meddling. So you take a larger view. The Vietnamese taught me to take a longer view.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
that helps for science fiction.
Yeah.
Okay. So Terry, but I was in preparation for this session. I read Fire on the Mountain and a couple of your other books. And I was reading somewhere that Fire on the Mountain, you started writing that in federal prison. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? What landed you in federal prison?
Well, I was not a political prisoner for very long. It was only 3 months. After the commune movement, I became much more in the 80s, in the late 70s and the 80s. I moved to New York I had been, part of the country commune movement. We were living on a farm in Kentucky. We moved to New York, my wife and I, and we joined one of the groups that was, by this time, the anti-war movement was almost gone, and the Weather Underground had begun to surface, and they had kind of splintered apart. And we were in one of the groups that was, I call the sort of leftover stuff from Weather Underground. And it was called the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. And we did, so we did public actions and stuff. And I was still not much of an organizer, but I would do what had to be done. And this was also a time of the Puerto Rican movement, but the FALN was operating and fighting for independence for Puerto Rico. We were supportive of that. And some other of our people had gone underground and were doing stuff that actually illegal, like robbing Brink's truck in New York. A lot of people got busted for that.
Very good friends of mine.
Yeah, well, me too. One just got out of jail the other day after 40 years.
Yes.
Anyway, the point what was my point I was trying to make? Oh,
well, I was asking you how you ended.
Oh yeah, well, they subpoenaed 5 of us in the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, thinking that we would lead them to some of these people that were underground that had been doing what I thought was ridiculous bombings, like trying to build the Weather Underground again, saying, let's just do it again. If we try harder, it'll work this time. But I love these people, and they were underground, but we deliberately didn't have contact with them. We knew that they were somewhere, but we weren't in contact. But there was a principle, this is, to make a long story short, there was a principle in the movement that you did not cooperate with the FBI or the government, especially when it's investigating the left, and especially to turn in your friends and stuff. So our position was non-collaboration. We did not answer the subpoenas. We didn't show up at the grand jury. And then we were, so it's not a crime, but they can put you in jail hoping that maybe you'll change your mind. And some of us were in jail for about 12 months. Others, it took a while to. So anyway, I was only in jail for 3 months, and it was, So I did have some experience, but I was not a serious revolutionary that was captured by the government.
Okay. For those, again, for the benefit of those who may not know, can you just flesh out a bit more, either you, Terry, or Marge, either one of you, who were the Weather Underground? I think most people today, if they've heard of the organisation at all, know it as a collection of domestic US radicals who were trying to overthrow the US state, and there were bombings and robberies and things like that, but they don't know very much else about it. Who were the Weather Underground?
Basically, what was happening was we got more people in the anti-war movement. We got more and more desperate because we tried and we tried and we tried. And instead of them moving out and letting the Vietnamese alone, they moved into Laos and Cambodia. There was this horrible bombing. There was everything going on. People almost went crazy to try to stop it because it was so real to us what was going on over there. And I think that that when SDS split, they decided that nothing was working and that you had to take direct action. You had to try to foment a real revolution. And at that time, this may seem stupid to you, but we believed we could make a revolution because we were in touch with people all over the world. We really thought that we could, and they carried it a step further. Now, I disagreed with number of the things they were doing, but they were friends of mine. I mean, so I stayed in touch with them. I learned all the craft you do when you're shaking tails and doing all that stuff. And I went on meeting with them. And sometimes we'd argue and sometimes we'd agree, but they were my friends and I wasn't going to give up on them because their face was on the post office walls.
Yeah.
But it was such a, I can remember the Christmas bombing. I was on the Cape by then. I'd had to leave New York because I'd been sick in the lungs. It just such a sense of desolation. You felt like you had to do something. You had to do something.
Which again, you capture that sense really effectively in Dance the Eagle to Sleep.
Yeah.
It has that very almost dystopian tone of a group of people who are so desperate for social change. And of course, there's splits in the movement as to which way they'll try and go to pursue that social change, you know. So that's a very accurate depiction of how you were feeling at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, for me also, I would say I was not, some of them were my friends after the war, but I was never part of Weather, but I was always, what the Weather was for me, it was radicals in the US who were protesting the imperialism and colonialism. And they took the shift from saying, we're not just sympathizers with this, we have to take the same risks that they're taking in Vietnam, that they took in Cuba. We have to actually raise the stakes for ourselves and do stuff. And they did that. And I think there was a big tragedy where 3 people were killed. But other than that,
one of them was a very good friend of mine.
Yeah. And so I think that they were the first US organization to take a white, especially, they were mostly middle class, many upper middle class white kids. And a lot
of them weren't middle class. I mean, that's partly an illusion. I knew an awful lot of people who were working class or came out of the projects who were involved in SDS.
Yeah.
I myself came out of poverty.
No, I know. I'm talking about the leadership of Weather. At any point, my point is they took a very important
the Central Committee.
An anti-imperialist position, and it appealed to me. And it was a position that I don't think many groups in the U.S. have taken over the years, and still haven't. The Panthers did in a way, you know.
Oh, they absolutely did.
Yeah, and they thought of themselves as internationalists, and so that's so weather was, and see, it also, SDS was at the verge of a split. I learned this later. I wasn't there, but I know many people who were. And there was a group called, what was the other group that was trying to take over SDS?
I was trying to think of the name just now.
But their whole thing, they didn't support nationalism. They didn't support the Black Panthers. They didn't really support the Vietnamese people. And the other large faction of weather people said, this is who we are. We should not be doing political work as white people in the US if we don't see the importance of the Black Panthers. And so they split over that and a number of other things and walked out and made, anyway, that's what I admired about weather. And they came out of SDS and they had they were many of the people who had this enormous success building this anti-war movement among youth, a lot of college students and people in the US. It was like magic. It happened. And so I can only sympathize with them when years later they do the same stuff and they think it's going to work. And because they had such success, they thought, we worked magic, let's do it again. Well, they didn't do it again.
Yeah, right. I mean, of course, Marge, your 1979 book, Vida. What was the genesis of that book? How did it relate to where you were politically as a writer in the 1970s in the aftermath of the Vietnam War?
Well, I wanted to write about what it was like for people to be underground, what that took out of people, what they did manage to do, what they didn't manage to do.
No.
When it came out, I said, oh, I did my research in the New York Times and blah, blah, blah. But one time when I was giving a reading, friends of mine who'd come up from underground said, oh, it's about us. So then I stopped bullshitting. Yeah, I knew a lot of people who were underground. So I knew about their lives and I knew how they worked and what they did. So I fictionalized it to protect them because when I wrote the book, they weren't up.
Yeah.
They were still under. So I was always aware of protecting people.
Yeah, right. I mean, the other thing I'm interested in, and this is just a personal interest that I have in it, is that the cohort of 1960s radicals that were hiding from the government and the police in the 1970s, was it just the Weather Underground, or was that? No,
I had other friends. No,
so there was a much larger movement.
Gone down from a lot of people have gone down. And of course, don't forget, there were all the deserters.
Yes, right, of course.
I used to help them get to Canada when I was in SDS. And there were a lot of them stayed in the States and went underground. Yeah, there were a lot of people underground besides Weather Underground. I knew a number of them.
Yeah. Weather Underground was the most public about it, and they were completely.
They were the most organized,
and they were protected by people. But there were lots of other people who did stuff clandestinely that nobody ever knew about. A lot of draft boards were bombed, and that kind of stuff. It was a time people were angry and looking for stuff to do, and were not. It was that kind of time.
There were even radical nuns who attacked draft boards. Yeah. I knew some of them too. They went to. There were a lot of people who went to jail. By the way, it wasn't just students. I was doing off-campus organizing with people in all kinds of works. People who worked, teachers, people who worked in city planning. We did a lot of organizing off campus, including, of course, some of the groups. We did the first food co-op, etc. And also, of course, the motherfuckers were part of our organization.
Yeah, right, of course. But it was all very dispersed. There was no central sort of group organizing all of this, yeah?
No,
except we were in New York. But no, the SDS was an anarchist organization. It was always very decentralized. If you're in Iowa and you want to do a certain kind of action, you do it. You don't go and ask anybody's permission.
And just one other historical question, because I think a lot of people are interested about this. Roughly how long did this go for? So this underground movement,
Oh,
which
when
of
they
course,
were underground, 79, at least for 10 years.
right,
Because children were born and grew up underground.
right, yeah.
Well,
Most of them never got caught. But there was a time when it was futile to stay underground, so they began working ways to turn themselves in. Some of them had to serve prison time.
Terry, what were you going to say?
well, I was going to say it was the draft, the victory of the Vietnamese people, U.S. leaving. The air went out of it all, and the counterculture, many parts of it were still there, but as an anti-war movement, that wasn't there. But like I say, I got involved in 78 or 79 with people who were trying to bring it all back because it had been such a great thing, but that didn't work. And so
Well, you can't do that. It never works like that, do you?
it doesn't seem to, no.
No.
But see, we were all, I was thinking the other day, we're not, the literature, we look at Vietnam had an enormous impact on American literature. Look at all the groups, the books that were written about Vietnam. That none of them are science fiction books. They're written by, I've forgotten their names. I've read, other people know these writers better than me, but there were a lot of very good books about Vietnam, but none of them came from science fiction. Science fiction had this oblique impact. Science fiction was impacted by the war, but I don't think science fiction, the main influence in science fiction was I think what Marge was saying, the arrival of the, not the new left in science fiction, but the new breed of that women came into the movement, and the writers in the movement had a more international, a less colonialist view of the world. Science fiction became less and less about us colonizing this planet or that kind of.
But that surely was one of the direct consequences of Vietnam. I mean, an internationalization of sorts, an awareness of what was going on of sorts, a huge movement that then people like Marge had a critique of in terms of its sexism and in the way its dynamics and things like that. That's all part of that ferment of the anti-Vietnam War movement, surely.
Right. And science fiction was definitely influenced by the anti-war movement, but we were not direct. I don't think science fiction was a direct part of it in a way. That it was actually more in the mainstream literature, literature.
I don't know. I had a lot of response to Dance the Eagle to Sheep.
Sorry, say that again, Marge?
I said I had a lot of response to Dance the Eagle to Sleep.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well,
and of course, Woman on the Edge of Time.
Yes,
It was the utopian side of it, trying to imagine how we could have a better society, how we could ever get to be more egalitarian and less racist and less sexist, less anti-everything that counts.
Yeah, no, I think the counterculture in general changed a lot of literature, but it changed science fiction really in pivotal ways, much more so than mainstream literature. But we didn't change, our literature didn't change the world as much as the world changed our literature. That's what I'm
Sure.
I see.
So,
yeah, I agree.
So we are a forward-looking, and science fiction has a role to play in the world to move things, to be able to look forward and stuff. But I don't think that we were big and I think in general, that's what we're supposed to do. But I think the Vietnam was not, in itself, was not what changed us as much as the counterculture in the U.S. and in literature as a whole. But maybe it's getting too vague to be.
No. Well, I mean, it's not as though
Agitprop is aimed at getting you to do something. I produced a lot of it when I was organizing demonstrations. You know, the agitprop aims you to do a specific thing. Come out, march tonight, do this, do that. What science fiction, what literature does is alter the imagination of the people who read it. It's not real, but it's like as a dream can affect you after you work. It makes your brain different so that you can imagine a better future or a worse one or whatever. I think it's the imagination it works on rather than society directly in any way.
Well, I think that's very true. And it seems to me like the science fiction, I'm part of this new science fiction. I came into the movement, into the science fiction community in the late 70s. And so that's who science fiction was to me. But I knew the old stuff. I had been a 12-year-old who read Heinlein and Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke,
Likewise,
and Ray Bradbury and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And it had a progressive edge to it also. But for the most part, I think science fiction in the 30s and the 40s and 50s was a promotional literature for space travel. And it was basically, I felt like most of it had to do with going to the moon and going to Mars and going off the Earth. And it worked. It really organized a lot of the as Marge says, it changed the imagination of people enough that Kennedy himself could say, oh, we'll go to the moon, because we could, and we knew it. We knew that the 3-stage Saturn rocket could be built. And but science fiction promoted a future that was still pretty imperialist, pretty American, pretty male-oriented, all that kind of stuff. And it had a huge impact for a certain period of time. And then I think it went away in the very late 20th century and up to today. And it's a much more, well, it's about different things. It's not very often about space travel. You know?
I got into science fiction earlier than that. I was in college. We were haunted by nuclear war. We thought we were all going to die.
Oh, yeah.
I was in school in college from 53 to 57. And no mainstream literature wasn't dealing with the sense of doom, this terror we had, that we didn't trust the government, we didn't trust the Russians, we didn't trust anybody, that they were going to kill us all. And the only place I could find that spoken to was in science fiction at that point. That's when I got into it.
Yeah.
And then I got out of it when it was all ray guns and bang, bang, and conquering this and conquering that. I lost interest for a while.
Yeah.
And then you got back into it. Why did you decide to write a science fiction novel after your first novel, Marge?
Well, because I wanted to deal with things that I couldn't deal with realistically without endangering people. And I felt that the society had become so surrealistic in many ways that was the only way to deal with it.
And I have to say too, I only read Dance the Eagle to Sleep, which I love, about 3 years ago, and of course that was during the Trump presidency, and all the horror around that. And it felt to me very, your book, not the Trump presidency, very fresh and very, very relevant to that period that things felt like they were going through under Trump, you know?
Yeah.
Your book had really survived that test of time in a really disturbing way.
I'm sorry, but yes. That was the vision I had was all came back. I thought we were moving forward. And then we made a huge leap backwards and a violent leap backwards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose, look, it's relevant to ask this question now then. So we're now witnessing another war. This one, is playing out in real, well, there's wars all the time, but we're now witnessing another major conflict which has grabbed the attention of people in the West, unlike many sort of smaller conflicts that just bubble away and no one ever really hears about them.
I mean, don't forget, we started a huge number of wars.
Yes.
For almost my entire life until Biden pulled us out of Afghanistan.
Sure.
This country was always at war.
Do you think that the anti-Vietnam War movement and the counterculture and the radical movements of the 1960s and 70s generally, including the science fiction that came out of it, offer any ongoing lessons for how people might act in this current conflict, or are we in a new sort of space, a new phase? Terry, you're shaking your head.
I think it's all new at this point. I have no way of assessing. No, I don't think. There's one book I think. A good friend of mine is Kim Stanley Robinson. I don't know if you know his book about. It's about the climate crisis called "The Ministry for the Future."
We haven't even talked about the climate crisis. Yes, of course,
Yeah,
but
well,
yeah.
And it's literally a science fiction book that writes about a successful intervention into the global warming and the heating of the atmosphere, and it's I think that's what a science fiction book can do, and I think that does it very well. It's had a big impact. He got invited to the Glasgow thing, was a special guest and spoke there many times. A lot of people are reading it because it's about climate. Do you know that book at all, Marge? Have you ever heard of it?
No, I don't.
Yeah. Well, of course, Stan wrote Green Mars, and he's quite a well-known science fiction author these days. But this, I think, is really, it's the only science fiction book that deals with to me, actually the world in which we actually live right now. But
Is she in it? Doesn't?
I don't know that one. See.
Oh, that's a lot about climate change. And
What was that book again, Marge?
Oh.
What book did you just mention?
He, she, and it.
He, she, and it, right.
Now, I don't know.
He, she, and it's about climate change and about the power of huge corporations and politics becoming just a spectator sport.
Huh. Oh, I have to read it. I haven't been reading much. Now, you wrote this when?
1991.
Oh, okay. That's
ahead of her time, as always. So, Marge, do you have any views about that, about what lessons the anti-war movement and the science fiction that came out of it may have for now? Or do you think, like Terry, we're in totally new territory?
Media has had such a huge effect that none of us really imagined. I dealt with it some in He, She, and It. But earlier, we couldn't imagine the world in which people live mostly online, in which huge lies can be manufactured and disseminated without the apparatus of the government necessarily.
Yeah.
It's just, we live in a world that is very peculiar, in which often ordinary people's best friends are people they see on television. And people have all these friends online. I have about 7,000 friends online. Maybe I know 30 of them. I mean, we live in a world that has gone crazy in certain respects. And trying to grasp it and grasp what it all means is an ongoing activity, which requires science fiction.
In what way does it require science fiction?
Because it is was so unimaginable to see where it's going and what it's doing. I don't think anything else can grapple with it.
Yeah, and I suppose also, I mean, you said in an interview in 2010, it's a really good quote, and I'll just do the quote. And It's about Americans, but I think it's more than just Americans, obviously. Americans, by and large, have lost a sense of history. I had a student in a junior women's studies class gig ask me when I mentioned the Vietnam War, is that the same as the Civil War? Anything more than 5 years in the past is sloughed off, which is sort of part of that information online world. It's a confusing, media saturated world where there's so much information, but at the same time, so little understanding necessarily of the information, which is something that New Wave science fiction picked up on very, very strongly.
Yes. And it's just, the history disappears. That's why I've written historical novels.
Yeah.
I've written a number of those because I have to, my question is, how did we get here? That's a question I'm always asking.
And Terry, your focus, just to maybe to end on this question, Terry, several of your novels focus on alternative, more radical versions of America. There's Fire on the Mountain in 1988.
Yeah.
Probably Left Behind, Any Day Now. Is this focus an attempt by you to sort of provide a literary counterbalance and inspiration to where the US and much of the world appears to be headed in reality?
I have no idea what you mean by that.
I mean, why are you so interested in alternative radical versions of America, I suppose?
Well, that comes out of my novels because that's what I think about. That's what it's funny, the only novel I've written about, I've written several novels, but the one called Any Day Now is basically an alternate history of 1968, which is where this program started. We're all talking about the 68 and its impact on the U.S., the Vietnam War, and Any Day Now is a way of people said, "Oh, you were part of the commune movement. Oh, you were here, there. You should write about it." And I would say to people, we all know how it turned out. But I thought, what if it turned out a different way? So Any Day Now is about the Vietnam War leading to a breakdown in the U.S. military and in the U.S. election system and a balkanization of the U.S. into different zones. And it's a radical science fiction view of another of the U.S. And I explore that kind of stuff. But right now, I mean, I don't know what, I was very surprised and delighted by the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement in the response to George Floyd's murder. When these are routine things that happen in the US and you've got people around the world demonstrating. And I couldn't have anticipated that. It's still unbelievable that it did. And it happened totally by surprise to most of the people in the movement. And so, and then the growth of the right wing, even beyond Trump, these like the attack on the Capitol with all these wannabe military guys and shit. That's all a surprise to me. So I can't really anticipate. I don't know what I think. I don't know what's going to happen. You know, and I say I'm not a big one for working, for organizing in public, but somebody's doing it. There's stuff going on, but it beats me.
Younger people.
Yeah.
And maybe younger writers.
Yes, absolutely. And it should be.
Are you reading any younger science fiction writers, Marge? Do you read much science fiction these days?
No, not recently. Partly, I'm reading, I read an awful lot of poetry now. And I read poetry by people of all ages. I no longer can get my fiction published. I've aged out of the market.
That happens too. Yes, me too.
And so it's just, you know, all the editors in New York are like 24-year-old Harvard graduates with trust funds. I don't do well with them. Yeah. So I've written short stories that PM published. And I write I write poetry all the time because my poetry is accessible to people and people use it. unlike an
I'm in
old
the-
time poet.
We have
Where
a
people,
poem in the new monthly review. I'm always,
yeah, I just sent them a new poem called Obfuscation about Trump and his just flushing things down the toilet and so forth.
Okay, well, I think we might wrap things up there. I don't know where Peter's gone. He's still here. I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we've got a few more minutes if you want to wrap it up with something.
I've wrapped it up. I don't know whether anyone's
Okay.
got any questions in the chat that they want to basically ask Marge or Terry.
Yeah, we could take something. Let's see.
Yeah.
One remark about Terry's work. It isn't all sun and sunshine and
Oh no, absolutely not. No.
I mean, think of that story of his about everybody gets a license to do everything bad that they want to do. You just pay for it. That's hardly utopian.
no, it's not utopian. at all.
You have some very dark visions too.
Yes, it's true.
I just wanted to put that in because I've read a lot of him. And
Yeah.
it's-
Well, I really want to thank you all for being here and taking the time. And Andrew, I'm hoping you feel better. I know it's really late there, so appreciate you, braving the time difference. Want to remind everybody, we've posted links in the chat with which you may purchase books, not just Dangerous Visions, but also books by Ms. Piercy and Terry Bisson. So our next session coming up, it's titled The Bridge of Lost Desire, a conversation with Samuel Delany. It's going to be moderated by Daniel Shank Cruz, begins at 12:30 Pacific time, 3:30 Eastern time, and well, whatever else there is out there.
Can I ask a question
Yes, please.
for Andrew?
Yes.
Yeah, please.
Andrew, you had an article in this book, The Dangerous Visions, about responses to nuclear war and science fiction's response to nuclear war. And you never mentioned Canonical for Legalism. I wonder why that is.
Yes, that was one of the things that moved me at that
Well,
time.
I mean, that's actually, we mentioned that when we talk about religion and science fiction. Terry, we just couldn't mention everything.
I know, but it's the most important one.
Oh, but everyone's got a book that they think is the most important book
No,
on
that's
science
not
fiction.
just
and
me.
nuclear.
It's still in print after all
Yep.
these years. It has a huge impact. And
Yeah, I have read it. I think it's a terrific book. No, I didn't have the space to mention it.
okay.
Well, I think what's wonderful about Dangerous Visions, it has opened up so many doors. And
But we
and
did mention it. We did, as I say, we did write about it in the context of how new wave science fiction dealt with religion and organized religion and notions around religion and how that changes.
Huh.
Isn't the cover in there too? I think the cover is in there.
Absolutely,
might be.
yes. Very
Yeah,
much so.
I got the cover in there at least. So
Anyway, it was just, I thought it was curious because anyway, he wrote a sequel to it, and I actually worked on the sequel. I never met the man, but I worked on one of his books. And but anyway, it's a book, but the religion, everything went back to Catholicism. We were back in the 9th century in Miller's stuff. But anyway.
well, once again,
Well-
thank you. Oh, Marge.
And thank you very much for joining us. That's right. And everyone is, yes, virtually saying thank you for joining us. But yeah.
Marge, did you have something to say? I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I've written Jewish science fiction. She and Ed is very much Jewish.
Oh, actually, would you talk a little about that? I would like to hear more about that because, David Meltzer was very much into Kabbalah and try to incorporate a lot of stuff into his work.
Yeah, well, that's my discipline, my meditation discipline. I studied it with various rabbis. I'm not somebody who believes in a personal God, but knowing those techniques of meditation are very, very useful. And you hit something. There's something, whether it's Gaia or just energy, but there's something you encounter sometimes that sort of takes you over.
Yeah. Karen asks, are you taking questions? You know, if you want to shoot a question in, sure. We've got a few minutes. So go for it, Karen, if you wanted to ask something. I think Karen's going to ask us a question in just a sec. Let's see if we can. Let's see.
I'm looking at Cliff Winnig.
Yeah, he's a science fiction writer who lives out here in the Bay Area, but he doesn't always dress like that.
Here we go. So let's see.
Can Marge talk about the ending of Women on the Edge of Time?
Yeah, there we go.
The ending of it is she is, you know, that she's punished for the action she took. And that people do end up in prison who take action, liberatory action. I mean, Terry ended up there.
Well, the Weather Underground people, yes.
Yeah. Well, can I say about women? I taught I'm not much of a teacher, but I taught at a little college out here in California a few years ago in utopias. And utopias are harder to find than dystopias in science fiction. But one of them that I used was A Woman on the Edge of Time, Marge's book. I loved it because it not only talked about what you would try to do in a utopia, but how you would do it and how difficult it would be. And I felt that was a marvelous book about how difficult it was to try to create a community that was actually liberatory and free and worked.
Here's another question we've got from Aisha. What do you think is one of the most important aspects of the 60s that a current writer could capture or address today, writing about that period? I feel like a radio announcer now.
Terry?
That's to both of you. That's to no one in particular. That's to both of you, I think.
For me, it's a sense of community. I think that every aspect of the 60s was about people looking to connect, because the connections were not real that we had in the 50s. And what, you know, you had the nuclear family, you had the job, you had the schools, but none of it touched the heart. None of it really was worth, at least for a small but significant fraction of people, whether you were in the commune movement or SDS or the women's movement or whatever, you wanted to connect with people and connect with others, and you didn't like the institutions that already existed that connected you. So everybody was trying to build connections.
I've never been so close to so many people in my life, and certainly never will be again.
Yeah,
The people who came through your life, you went someplace and you know that you'd find someone who'd take you in. You go any place if you were doing chapter organizing or whatever, and people, there was always someone who'd put you up. There's someone who'd feed you. Also, I will never forget talking about the non-political part of the movement. I remember the Bissons, and they were magical. They were like you'd imagine a medieval fair, but much better.
Me too.
People were handing their dope around. People were handing any food they had around. People were wearing all these flowing garments and bright colors and all sorts of things. And people were dancing and making music. And I've never experienced anything before it, and never anything since that was so communal.
Yes, that was it. And look at Woodstock.
I think rave culture sort of approached that a little bit, you know, like in England, and, you know, the caravan cultures had a little of that.
Could be, but no, I think
it was very marvelous and accepting. You didn't feel like you had to primp much. The only time I ever wore makeup and got dressed up if I was infiltrating something. The rest of the time, you know, we liked hair. We didn't want men to shave their chests, and women didn't certainly want to shave their genitals. I mean, Jesus, what's wrong with hair?
That's why hair.
I mean,
So
do we
we-
want to, do we have much more time, Peter? Because we do have
Yeah,
one more question.
let's take like one more, and I think
One
then
more
we'll-
and then we'll,
yeah,
okay.
one more
So
and we
this
can
is,
wrap. Yeah.
I can just see this from Cliff. My question, time permitting. I was a child during Vietnam, but I remember the TV broadcasts of combat footage. That seemed then and seems now a big part of the reason people turned against the war.
Yeah.
I see that happening now in Ukraine, but faster. Zelensky's videos are being shared worldwide. So are images of footage of the conflict. It's a very science fiction moment. And here's the question. That was a comment. Do you think this is just an evolution, or have we reached a tipping point of real change in war movement, in war moving forward, like it involves paying world attention?
No, because during Afghanistan, we didn't see the kind of things happening to people that we saw during the Vietnam War. It was sheltered from us. We don't have investigative reporting anymore on the news. I'm old enough to remember when news people really challenged the government, really challenged things. Now they're very careful what they report. They don't want to scare Trump because maybe he'll come back.
Yeah. And everything you're seeing on this is coming through the eyes of the U.S. and the U.S. media and Ukraine hooking into it. But so I tend to be a little distrustful of it. I think it's I'm not a Putin supporter or think that this should be going on, but I do not think that the U.S. is an innocent in this thing, and I do not trust what they say about it. So I don't
trust Putin one bit.
No,
I think he's an egomaniac gangster.
I agree with that.
And no wonder Trump loved him and still loves him. They're both.
Peter, I think we might wrap it up on that.
Yeah.
point.
I'm just having such a great time. This could go on indefinitely, but I do have to start the next room. Hey, everybody. Thank you so very, very much. All the comments in the chat, really appreciate your engagement. Terry, Marge, Andrew, again, thank you for braving the time zones. We will see you all very, very soon. Please be safe, be well, everyone.
Okay, one question. Can we watch the next one by staying on here, or do we?
No, there's another link, and I can send you that link if you'd like.
Send it to me.
Yeah, be happy to do that. Okay.
All right. And Marge, it's such a pleasure spending time with you. I feel like I've spent some time with you all my life, and but here we are. I'm glad.
Well, I've read so much of your stuff that it's wonderful to see you and actually meet your real person.
Okay. Good. And thank you guys for putting this on and including both of us.
Thank you for being here.
An honor, a great honor.
Yes,
Go
indeed.
back to bed.
Cool.